Hello and welcome to a special edition of Threat Brief Live here at SCYTHE. I am your host, founder and CEO of SCYTHE, Bryson Bort. I am joined by a good friend, Rob Joyce, and head of labs, Trey Bilbrey. Rob, why don't you start with a quick introduction just in case people have never heard of the NSA?
Sure. So Rob Joyce, I worked 34 years at the National Security Agency. NSA has two halves. One half does signal intelligence, which tries to provide threat warning and strategic information for both policymakers all the way down to tactical military elements. And I worked a lot on that side. To include leading an organization known as Tailored Access Operations. That's the hackers of NSA. Later in my career, I finished as the Director of Cybersecurity. So that's the portion of NSA that protects our secrets. So it secures, makes the policies for classified networks, the warfighting networks, the intelligence networks of the U.S. government. And we also evolved that to use the SIGINT technology to chase the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans, and the Chinese around the internet, along with the cyber criminals. So I've played both sides of the fence, and I think that gives you a better appreciation, kind of like you, Bryson. You think differently when you've had to work on both sides of that. You realize how hard defense is at scale, and you also on offense realize, if it works, it's not stupid, and it's going to be used in the pursuit of exploits. So happy to bring that here.
Thank you. My only public affiliation with the NSA was overseeing the Advanced Cyber Training Program for the CNO operators. Other than that, I've never heard of you.
All good.
Trey, who definitely looks like a former Marine, who are you?
Well, hey everybody, I'm Trey, head of SCYTHE Labs here. Make a whole lot of kind of fun content. My background overlaps with these two, obviously, as Bryson just mentioned. While I was in the Marine Corps, I was a part of the cyber protection teams and worked with JFHQ DODIN, which was also kind of another leg in that whole NSA triangle that's going on there. So there's some overlap, and it's made for an interesting experience and kind of background.
So one of the things I like to highlight, whether you are a private institution or public institution, what is so unique about the industry of cybersecurity is you are up against military and intelligence organizations every day. It doesn't matter if you are trying to provide IT for orders at Mom's Bakery down the street. It doesn't matter if you are a municipal courthouse. It doesn't matter if you're Bank of America. It doesn't matter if you're the US military. They are taking advantage of the fact that everything is connected to the internet. And in this age, information systems are how we do modern business and conduct everything globally. So with that being said, Rob, why don't you hit it off with your view of the current geopolitical landscape writ large with all of the threat actors who are bedeviling us every day?
Yeah. So Bryson, over the course of my career, at the start, everything was about information, right? At the government level, we worried about our secrets being stolen. At the commercial level, we watched for years the Chinese and others steal intellectual property. The criminals try to grab information to go ahead and extort us. There is the criminal element just looking to directly monetize. But over time, geopolitics entered in, and now we see an increasing amount of cyber exploitation that goes on to do effects or preposition for effects. So there's not a geopolitical tension now that doesn't have some element of cyber pulling into it. You can look back, Ukraine, Russia, on the night of the invasion, we saw satellite service knocked out in Europe because they wanted to suppress the Ukrainian communications. And it had spillover effects into, wind farms in France and other things. You go forward to even the U.S. Venezuela, and you watch the air traffic control get impacted through cyber command technology. And that, is something that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs publicly talked about. We're in a new era where we talk about these things. And the president even went on to say that, technical capabilities were used to take down the power grid. So all of that compounds in whenever there's military efforts, there's going to be cyber. But the one that sticks out strongest for me is the Chinese and the Volt Typhoon intrusions. So that's China pre-positioning in critical infrastructure. There are efforts against rail and air and ports and pipelines and electric and a whole number of critical infrastructure pieces. And the reason they're doing that is, one, as you would expect, it's a military effort to try to keep us from being able to deploy in time of crisis. But it was interesting where the director of NSA, the director of CISA, the director of FBI all went to Capitol Hill to testify, and they declassified a bunch of intelligence to say, look, one of the other reasons the Chinese are doing this pre-positioning is for, quote, societal panic. They want to induce societal panic at the time of escalating tensions. And, that societal panic is a fancier word for terrorism. They want the American people terrorized and paying attention to what happens here and not on the other side of the globe. And you can see that in Iran-Israel conflicts and other places where, the effects are going beyond just government. And as you mentioned, goes well into the civilian sector. And, when an electric grid becomes a target of cyber activity, that's going to hit all of us in our personal lives or in our business lives. So it's a big deal these days.
It's really interesting when you think about how it comes together as well. You mentioned it's not just like Iran or China hitting against our government. They're hitting critical infrastructure, private companies. You are seeing more and more this overlap of it's no longer nation state against nation state. They're quickly and rapidly deploying other cyber hacktivists, criminal organizations, all kinds of different little groups for that deniability and the plausibility of, oh, well, that wasn't us. That was just someone that likes to operate in our space. So it's not clear lines anymore. It's not a clear fight.
Absolutely. The hacktivists, putting on the cloak of national defense, it's often unclear. Sometimes it's really clear, but you can't prove it as to who's behind it. And, I know one of the topics today is Iran, and a lot of people wanted to talk about the threats from Iran to the U.S. I really fixated on the threats to Iran and some of the things that happened. So, the one I would talk about is the 12-day war where, June of 25, an Israeli, pro-Israeli group called Predatory Sparrow went, and on the night of the Israeli bombings into Tehran, Predatory Sparrow went and destroyed the data at Bank SEPA. They went to a bank inside Iran, zeroed the accounts, so the bank didn't know what they owed people or what the holdings were of private citizens. Now, ostensibly, that bank was chosen because it does payment for the IRGC, an Iranian intelligence military affiliated entity. But there are a lot of civilians that have their funds in that bank too. So that to me was a crossing the Rubicon moment where, this whole bank was zeroized, but banking is, it's a web of trust. No bank holds all the assets they need to pay out everything they have. And if you're worried that the bank can't pay you back, it starts the run on the banks. And other banks inside Tehran suffered runs on banks, even at the same time Bank SEPA was down hard. So yeah, these things flow outward. And again, the attribution on that, the people that claimed responsibility was the pro-Israel group persona that, at times looks a little thin, like it could be, nation state on the others. And the fact that it was very closely tied to the night of the opening kinetic strikes really, sets a pattern. But what we've got here is, civilians inside the blast radius of nation on nation attacks.
And so that blast radius sets up the why do I care about this, right? Traditionally, you wouldn't care that the Russian military is doing something because it is highly unlikely that they're going to put on ski masks and come and rob you. However, courtesy of the internet, they now can and will. And so we have our four bad actors: China, Iran, Russia, and North Korea. I like to summarize the geopolitical influences as I think I'm quoting you on this, in fact, right? If Iran is a hurricane, then China is climate change. And that is that low and slow, which we see as their national strategy with as everybody likes to reference, the 100-year plan. And I always look at Russia and Iran more as befitting to their military capabilities, more of a regional annoyance. And so, but that being said, they're still targeting the United States because of our involvement in those regions. And so you see the alignment of cybersecurity, terrorism, or I liked that societal panic, where there are cyber effects, as you noted with Predatory Sparrow in the Iranian campaign, of impacts tied to what they're trying to do. And then North Korea, I just chalk up to organized crime as a state.
Yep.
Dear leader needs whiskey, cars, and going back to the time of the Soviet Union, you couldn't conduct military and intelligence operations outside of your sphere of influence without US dollars, without hard currency. And so North Korea needs hard currency, hence the propensity for crime and a lot of the crypto work. And of course, the reason that they're putting IT workers into the US workforce, because those people also get paid too. So there's a cash coming in on that. So the other part of this is cyber threat intelligence starts with who you are, right? Threat intelligence isn't just what are they doing, it's what are they doing to us. And once you understand that motive and why you're a target and what about you makes you a valuable target, then I think it makes it a lot easier to understand and defend. Because one of the things that frustrates me is, and I'll point to China as the example, particularly in critical infrastructures, we're going China, 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 China. And I go and I talk to folks in small rural, electric co-ops, and they're raising a bond in their county for $500,000, which is a lot of money to put on the citizenry. And they're going off in a direction because they've been so afraid of this threat. And it isn't about just being afraid. It's about being informed and doing what actually makes a difference. So that's the cyber threat intelligence piece. I think that comes back to what we can harvest and actually apply. So just so we can knock it out of the way now, let's address AI and Mythos and then never speak of it again on this podcast. And I told Rob I would torture him on this because Rob's like, I'm so glad I don't have to do that. I'm like, well, actually, Rob, you just said something really cool, which I'd like you to say for the audience. So, Mr. Joyce, your perspective on how Mythos may or may not be creating the Terminator to destroy us all.
Yeah, so we're 13 minutes in, Bryson. So congratulations.
You made it that far. Hey, look at that. That's all around.
Amazing. So I look at Mythos. First, I will start with it is a real capability, and it is a step change above what existed before it. But I would say that we've been on this increase of threat and capability from AI for 12, 18 months now, where AI is enabling people to go faster, more aggressively, and be more capable. What it is not doing is it's not making up brand new magic ways to hack. It is able to find the weaknesses and the insecurities that are present either in your software or in your network or in your hygiene and make that a liability. So the way I look at it is the people that have accrued tech debt and have issues with their program and their security, they're under more pressure and more danger in this world where the AI agents now become the capable hackers. I think that, one of the things we've all got to do is we've got to get really good at the fundamentals. We've got to look at, where we have unpatched devices and where we have, AWS buckets exposed with bad permissions, and where we have, people writing software that hasn't gone through an SDLC pipeline to check it for vulnerabilities and weaknesses. So if you get really good at the fundamentals, you will be strong and resistant against these tools. But if you have issues, they're going to render them more accessible and more capable. So I think, you think of the big bell curve of people who are able to operate in cyberspace. It's going to pull the script kiddies up. It's going to give them capabilities they didn't have. And again, it's not going to be nation state level capabilities. So if you've locked your doors and windows in cyberspace, you'll keep the script kiddies out. But it's also going to enable the high-end actors. So the people who do know how to do cyber operations, it's going to enable them to do more and faster. I think about my time at NSA, and on offense, we did really well against the targets we needed to go after. Not because of astounding 0 days or incredible people. We had some of that, but what we had was information arbitrage. We knew the networks better than the people who owned and defended them. We knew some of the devices in the networks better than the people who built them, right, about the security operations of those. And so we would get this position of information dominance and finding the misconfigurations and the shadow IT and the open accounts and the default passwords and the things that should have been locked down but weren't. And now everybody can get an AI agent that will continuously pen test against the known knowns and deliver those. So I think that's the era we're in. It's not a step function of mythos and we're all in more danger. It's this slow boil that has been increasing. You look at things like the weaponization rates from a vulnerability to exploit. And, 5 years ago, they were, measured in months, 5 or 6 months. And a couple of years ago, they were measured in weeks. And now we're getting down to some of these, patch diff created exploits are happening in hours. And that is tooling and automation, and AI is only increasing that. And I also look at those tools and capabilities being available for quite a while, but they're just getting better. I look at last month's Patch Tuesday at Windows. It was the second biggest number of patches ever. And that was pre-Mythos. It was AI enabled because there's a lot of good people doing vulnerability discovery with AI tools before Mythos. And, that's the era we're in. So again, get good at the basics because you are under more pressure with these tools.
I would say you're 100% right there, Rob. This is something I think we've preached a lot here at SCYTHE, is just having those foundational level things in place and done, like understanding your actual attack surface, so like having asset and like hardware, software inventories, just having network segmentation, just those common principles of defense in depth, right, will go a long way against these threats. And to your second point there, when we're talking about AI-enabled operations and these threat actors having access to their own unchained models and things like that, that we can't do anything about that, but we can control the battle space that we're working in. We can control our environment, the tools they have access to once they're in, and our ability to detect and see them. So those are the kind of things people really need to focus on. And Mythos, I think, is a really cool advancement and a cool piece of news headline for people to see, but to the layman, it doesn't really have any kind of impact on their life. It's still the same fundamental things that matter.
Yeah, well, I do think it's going to up the urgency for being able to patch at speed and with rigor. The patches are going to come fast and furious for the next few months. Big companies across the internet, Apple, IBM, or Apple, Microsoft, Google, Palo Alto, they're all part of the Mythos program, and they are finding real vulnerabilities in their infrastructure. And so they're going to be rolling out more and more patches. And we're going to have to be able to consume those and act on them to close the vulnerable windows. And so we are in a changing environment, but everybody's just got to run faster.
So I'm going to bring in a stat to disagree and fight back.
Sure.
Mandiant M-Trends just published their 2026 report. And in there is where the mean time to exploitation is the statistic that's been tracked over time. The mean time to exploitation last year was -7 days, which means that it is 7 days before a patch is ever available that something's being exploited. My takeaway from that is patches aren't going to work. We need an alternative approach to vulnerability management because the patching isn't going to do it.
I'm in violent agreement with you, Bryson, there, where
well, let's argue about it then if we're
and I told you I've spent way too much time in the last 2 weeks talking mythos and mythos strategies. So yeah, a lot of people focused on vulnerability timelines, and I just pushed that, right, wave that flag around. But say you get instantaneous patching, the second it's distributed, you can put it into your network. You still have to contend with 0 days are more findable. And so now you've got to assume that all your devices that are internet facing, your firewalls, your VPN concentrators, your file transfer appliances, all of those things can have 0 days discovered in them. And that's where your -7 day timeline comes. So what's your strategy for dealing with my outside perimeter is going to be breached? And that's where segmentation, strong identity controls, and other things. I'm going back in the Wayback Machine. I am a growing fan of honeypots and deception technology now, where tripwire technology, where you're going to have something enter your network. How do you know that there's something in there? I like the ability to get something to tickle and set off a flare saying you've got to look closer because something's happening, right? But I do start with all of those fundamentals that just make you more secure, so that you can then have good hygiene and alerts and understanding. Knowing your network is fundamentally the best thing you can do, because that's going to let you secure it. You can't secure it if you don't know it.
I think these are really on point, and it brings us to another thought process here with everything we've seen happening in 2026 is if we can rapidly patch, that should solve the problems, right? Well, the stats tell us the answer there is no. On the flip side, if we are doing auto updates, rapid patching, we're pulling without testing and validating. We're kind of stuck now between a rock and a hard place. Either I wait my 30, 60, 90-day window for all of that testing and validation to happen and I potentially get exploited, or I just go ahead and auto update and push everything to prod and hope for the best. And now I'm caught by a supply chain attack. Like we've seen a string of them just between January and May now. I mean, we're probably well past a baker's dozen at this point, different supply chain attacks. So it's kind of, where do you fall between the two, right? And what do you do about it? You kind of have to accept some form of risk there. But like you said, having the ability for visibility in your environment, some way to control that space and influence it and have a tripwire, like you said, to let people know, hey, something weird's going on. This isn't normal. There's something in your environment. You should do something about it.
So I didn't run TAO, but I ran CNO ops elsewhere. And Rob gave you the summary of how they do it. And one of the advantages that we had is we had close access. So we were able to get people to do things with us to be able to do the things we wanted to do. And obviously, that is a very hard thing to defend against. And it was the same kind of, what really triggered that for me, Rob, is you're like, we didn't get caught because we knew their networks better than they do. And we didn't get caught because, one, we were able to invest in creating very sophisticated pieces of tool of what we built. And also because of the fact that we were already past a certain perimeter and there was a certain assumption of defense as a result of that. And as a result, that's where when I went to the commercial world, I kind of had always taken for granted that we always won. And in the commercial world, that is obviously, now we're on the other side of this. And red teaming comes nowhere close to what the real thing is. It can't afford to, no one can pay that, but that's okay. That's part of where you need to make conscientious decisions on a return on investment of what can I do at what level, and essentially what I call be the APT on the cheap. And And as a result from that, I came up with a very simple model to illustrate this problem, and I think ground the framework for this. I call it Bryson's attack model, BAM. Reconnaissance is building the target package. It's the thief deciding what house to break into. Can't really do a whole lot about that because a determined adversary is going to gain the necessary information or the knowledge of your network, which they can just get from LinkedIn today because you have all your tools listed in every job rec there. And then to this point is where I think psychologically this industry has been held up too much is the break-in, the initial access, initial code execution on host, the breach. Well, the thing about it is, again, going back to my time, when it's a mix of social and technical, you're looking at that from a technical nerd lens with technical controls, and why you're being surprised that, right, I phished you. Or in my case, right, we had somebody do something. I mean, you see that in the real world. And so your perimeter is going to be breached, which leads to the third part is the thief just picked the door and the door opens. They haven't walked through. They haven't done anything to you yet, right? They're on the perimeter. They have shell on a host. The next step is what matters, and where you should focus is assume the breach. And then what do our controls look like, right? You've listed several of them. Some of the folks in the audience are talking about segmentation and micro-segmentation. Defense in depth comes in here because at the end of the day, that's where you're in control, right? The saying that annoys the hell out of me more than anything else is the defender always needs to be right, the attacker needs to be right once.
Yes.
No, bullshit. That's just the initial access point. Once they're in, the attacker needs to always be right. Because all the defender has to do is catch one mistake, one sniff of anomalous behavior or malicious activity, and I've got you.
Yeah, as the defender, you own the terrain. You ought to have the advantage in your house. Yes.
Yeah, so assume breach, own terrain, and then focus on building your controls there. And guess what? You can have 0 day all day long. What that's going to do is one of two things. First of all, it's going to make the break-in happen. And then you can make the argument, well, I can use that to deceive, deny, and disable your defensive tooling. But guess what? Since it's your terrain, I'm still traveling in your space. And you know what? I could beat you on host all day long as an APT because the tricks I can do to do that on host, yeah, give that part up. But I have to create footsteps on the network. I have to create noise there. And that didn't change. And so by creating segmentation, creating heterogeneity, and focusing on that detection and response is my argument why I'm not kept up at night on this, because that game hasn't changed as you explained it, Rob, right? We just brought more here, but if you focus here, you've still got a castle.
Yep. And remember, you can find out a lot about a network through that open source reconnaissance and some scanning tools that may or may not be loud. But in the end, the attacker doesn't know everything about your network, and they have to figure out where the things are that they want to go and either collect, influence, stop, destroy. And in doing that, you have so many advantages as a defender to be able to observe, stop, block, and alarm on those things. I unfortunately have seen too many breaches where you go in and you find out they've got great logs in one part, but very little logging in another section of the network. Guess where the really skilled attackers are going to go, right? They're going to go into those dark corners. They're going to live there. And you have the advantage to think about your logging, think about your architectures that are going to give you the ability to understand what's normal and what's abnormal. And it pains me to watch at times how we are not well set up to take advantage of that defensive that defensive dominance you should be able to achieve.
All right, we have completed the AI conversation. Check. We also just gave great security advice, which again, it is the fundamentals, right? I mean, blocking and tackling, you do hygiene on the perimeter, but really that defense in depth is going to be where they're on your terrain. Well said. So are you worried about Iran? If so, why, how, what do we do?
If you'll indulge me to take you through what I think are the Iran eras and how I think about it. I think of Iran as the scrappy young sibling of the big cyber powers, right? They're not China. They're not Russia. They are the only top tier state actor that built their program from almost a feeling of victimhood, right? They had Stuxnet in 2010. It didn't just blow out centrifuges. It convinced the regime that cyber was this asymmetric domain. And, they were sanctioned, they're technically isolated, but they felt that they could build a program to land punches on superior adversaries, right? And if you look, every subsequent capability investment they did kind of traced back to that founding trauma almost. China built cyber out of long-term industrial espionage going back. Russia built it out of their Soviet GRU, FSB, special operations. Iran was almost out of grievance in this. So I think of them in three periods, arcs, three eras. 2010, right, starting from that Stuxnet to 2014, they were reactive. They did brute force. They did smash and grab, kind of vengeance almost operations. They had a wiper virus that went after Saudi Aramco, hit 30,000 PCs back in 2012. They claimed that was in retaliation for, some of the U.S. operations and things. They were going after U.S. banks, right? We sanctioned them, and they tried to DDoS banks off the internet. They even did the casino wiper against Sands because Sheldon Adelson publicly suggested nuking Iran, and they went after the Sands casino. So they had destructive intent, mediocre tradecraft. They were loud, attributable. They were clumsy, but they got their emotional outbursts out there. 2015 to 2020, that's where they started to professionalize. You'll see a bunch of APT labels. The community started to watch them stand up persistent espionage. There were a whole bunch of targeting against U.S. University. At the same time, they started to have their toolkits leaked. But when they were identified and their tools leaked, instead of collapsing, they rebuilt with more discipline. So they've been a learning organization in that. They also started these private companies, the IT Sec team, Mersad, Eminent Passagard, these companies that are made up of privateers that by day, serve the Iran regime, and at night would do everything from ransomware to independent thefts that they drove their own. And they started recruiting pipelines through the universities, right? And this is the era where they started to kind of do espionage like a real intelligence service. 2021 to 2026, that to me today, they're in this hybrid era. They have faketivist personas, right? That the cyber avengers who, like we started talking about earlier, claim to be independent, motivated, politically motivated people. But in reality, when you pull back the covers, we're seeing, the tendrils all the way back to the intel services. But they get some deniability and information operation amplification. We also see them have specialization. So there's initial access brokers, people who just get access and then farm it down to others who are going to be either doing ransomware, criminal things, or disruption for hire without the government owning the destructive event. And then we see the APTs out of the state doing criminal false flags, muddy waters, chaos ransomware, right? And things like the Stryker Intune wiper event that came after, some random healthcare supplier company in the US, not because it was strategically relevant to the ongoing war with the US, but because they could, right? So they land real effects, but without having deep capability to last and long. and survive long term. So that's kind of how I see them, Bryson. Happy to dig in. It's interesting to talk about what they're actually good at as well.
Yeah, can you expound on persistent espionage? Sorry, Greg. What did you mean by persistent espionage?
They've spent effort trying to understand, Israel and their tactical capabilities. They've focused on the U.S. military over a number of years. So they, instead of being opportunistic, they've started to put the AP in advanced persistent threat. They will spend time and effort over and over again trying to get into a target. And often their persistent focus is on government entities, not on the opportunistic ransomware kind of thing or critical infrastructure hacks.
Trey, you had something?
Yeah, he made some really good points about kind of their methodologies and mindset, and it's really interesting to see kind of the connections there of like you would say with Stryker, like it wasn't anything where it affected the current status of war and what's happening on that side of the world, but it did do something here, right? Did it target critical infrastructure? Did it target something that might inhibit our ability to respond? No, but it definitely incited fear. It definitely made big headlines. It was something to give people doubt, that whole like fear and fog of war kind of mindset when you think about warfare. That's exactly what that did. So it's a really interesting kind of psychological use case with the way they're doing things.
Let me ask the scary question. So we talk about the red line in cyber, and this conversation has touched on the fact that with challenges in attribution, third-party use, which we're going to come back and circle on because there's a parallel to how the Russian intelligence services are working, is that I've always argued, I've not been worried about whatever we debate the red line is, everybody knows it's the point where the U.S. military is going to come knock on your door, because we're not going to cyber you back. We're going to bomb you back.
Yep.
Or with Iran, we're already doing that. So is there a fear, like with Stryker being like, we did it because we could, that you have, that the Iranians don't feel constrained because there's nothing left for us to do?
Yeah, I've always worried about Iran, and they're the crazy drunk guy in the bar fight that just doesn't know any better, right? And I've always worried about them not understanding where sensible red lines were. And maybe that harkens all the way back to that feeling of victimhood. But they've been willing to do things like interfere in U.S. presidential elections, right? They tried to do some social engineering in that space in the first Trump election, things like that. Just you don't expect them to make good decisions. 12-day war. I mentioned that there's this back and forth with Israel. They very much go after critical infrastructure in that, and it may not be the wisest thing. They're willing to be a first mover on destructive cyber attacks. China has the capability, and they've restrained themselves for use in no kidding shooting war. When you look at Iran, they probably want to do a lot more against the U.S. than they're able to do, simply because they had like 50 some days without general internet connectivity. The place where they do nation state cyber attacks from was kinetically bombed. Some of their top leadership were again killed and kinetically targeted, both in the 12-day war and then again in the U.S.-Israel conflict. So if you want to talk about kinetic deterrence, right, there's a realization by some of the Iranian actors that if they stick their head up too far right now, when there are active bombing campaigns, they become a target in that. And so that's where you start to get to deterrence. So I think they're eroded in their ability to run some of these operations, but their willingness to kind of strike back and fight is undeterred.
Trey, you lead the threat intelligence for SCYTHE, and your teams put together the automated TTPs that we do in the platform. What are some things that you've seen in terms of procedural differences, right? So we've talked high level here. Now let's talk commands on keyboard. What do you see about matching? Also, Rob talking about the different levels of the growth in the Iranian cyber capability.
Well, what's really interesting here is his taxonomy, kind of like his whole like growth of their capability kind of hits the nail on the head. And I would say it's very accurate from what we're seeing. They're kind of like early stage, just kind of doing what they can, when they can, however they can. Has evolved in the way that they are custom building, like say their tools and payloads, things like their footer loader or the Muddy Viper backdoors. These they're putting some real thought and time and effort into. But as far as their tactics and behaviors go, once they're in the environment they're trying to affect, that is still very much stuck in their old era, their teenage angst phase, right? They're very loud, they're very noisy, and they're using old 10, 12, 15-year-old playbooks. Like they're still using startup registry run keys for persistence. They're still doing basic, they're doing a bit of automation with the behaviors they're executing, but they're still not really doing a ton of obfuscation. They're very loud, they're very noisy once they're on disk. They're not hands-on keyboard noisy, but they're still extremely loud. So there's, I would say from a procedural perspective compared to technology perspective, they're spending a lot of time on resource development, not a lot of time on, well, what do we do once we're in? They're just kind of like a kid in a candy store.
Yeah. So I also see them lack what I'd call tactical patience, right? They don't do strategic things long-term very well. What they are good at, they do social engineering at scale. So APT42 persona work, I think that's genuinely top tier. They successfully phished a senior Trump campaign advisor. They ran a fake Brookings webinar invitation against academics. They operate convincing journalist personas on LinkedIn, right? They invest in the human, not the exploit these days. They do a lot of living off the land and identity systems. So they password spray M365, trying to get accounts into your office environment. They abuse Active Directory, Azure AD to get to the MDM consoles. They exploit edge applications with default or stolen creds. We talked about Striker, Intune. They use zero malware in that, right? That's a capability, not a limitation, right? Because you don't have to worry about EDR, MDR. They've gotten pretty good at hack and leak choreography. Stealing data is one thing, and then figuring out how to release it through media-friendly personas with the timing keyed to political moments, that's a different skill. And Iran probably does that better than anybody except Russia.
They have been very good at playing on the psychological aspect. And you went exactly where I was going to go next. Their ability to get initial access is they're still preying on the personnel aspect of this. The password spraying piece is a part of it, weak and unsecure passwords, stuff that's been in breach forms. And then their ability to gain access, especially from like the critical infrastructure perspective, they're just scanning and poking and prodding very persistently all day, every day until they see a hole pop up. And as our world gets more and more connected and we want convenience more and more, they're just getting a lot more overall space to work in and to gain that access.
Yeah. It's also interesting watching them. One specialty they've invested in is OT targeting, but on what I'd consider the soft targets. They can't do Volt Typhoon class long dwell pre-positioning, but they can absolutely find your internet exposed Unitronics PLC that has a default password to get you embarrassed on the local news. if you look, I like there was an intrusion to the Alquipa, Pennsylvania Water Authority, right, back in 2023. The IRGC, under the Cyber Avengers persona, they went after the municipal water authority of a suburb of Pittsburgh, and tiny little thing, 15,000 residents. But what they did was they found a PLC controller they could go after, and the operators arrived to find the HMI interface defaced, saying you've been hacked down with Israel. And the reason they did this was not because that a suburb of Pittsburgh was strategically relevant. It was, again, because they could, and they felt that anybody that bought equipment made in Israel was a fair target in a post-Palestinian fight for Gaza world. So they, Unitronics was an Israeli vendor, and so they went after Unitronics across the globe, and the utility just happened to have an Israeli vendor supplying some of their IoT. So again, not caring about who they hit, but more caring about, let's make some noise, and because we can. It was embarrassingly simple, right? It was internet exposed, and I think I remember the password was like default 111, which you find in the manuals. So it was proof that the water system was of interest, but it was more to generate headlines and more to make a statement about Israel. Those were the things that mattered.
So you went right there with Volt Typhoon. I was going to highlight the dichotomy between strategic patience and pre-positioning. I have long referred to that for years as, I call it, levers for action. I cannot engage cyber offense for effect overnight, right? I can't point, be like, let's go do that. That's not available today. Particularly highlighting the depth that it takes to do something like a Volt Typhoon, which undermines that level of national critical infrastructure. That is not easy to do versus the drunk, crazy guy in a bar, which I do think is extra funny considering that they are a teetotaling theocracy. But the psychological profile still matches. Being able to do something simpler and what is internet facing, combining a census Shodan scan against some level of capability. And that strategic versus tactical, which I think, again, makes Iran even more dangerous, which is right. I will grant the metaphor, because there's nothing holding them back. And the capability is we can do what we can do. And now add in the fact, which you were talking earlier with two examples of providing enough third-party distance for plausible deniability and attribution with, you mentioned the Cyber Avengers and disruption campaigns, which I liken to the genius of the Russian military and intelligence apparatus doing the same thing with Eastern European ransomware gangs. And there's different levels of state-sanctioned and tolerated all the way to state-supported, where they're providing money, targeting, and resources. But the best part about it for the Russians is the ecosystem funds itself.
Yep. Unfortunately, very true.
So crime for national purpose.
You had a very good contrast there too between Iran in general and the way that they run their behaviors. And Volt Typhoon honestly is a great polar opposite with what we're seeing out of Iran, whether it's what we're calling nation state or it's cyber activism criminals. On disk, they're kind of very loud, noisy. They're using the default tried and trusty playbook, things that work but are easily caught. Volt, on the other hand, going for that actual true persistence, being able to hang out low and slow. They're not bringing in all of these kinds of crazy things. They're not even looking at running normal native commands on disk that they know will be triggered. They've done that research and watched it. So they're finding completely unique ways to still live off the land, but find the information they want without triggering some kind of detection rule or an alert. a great example of that is how they're doing user and host enumeration. A lot of people think, oh, well, I can just use, PowerShell to do like getTech local user or net use commands, things like that. Yeah, you can. It'll give you the data you want, but now you're on a timer. Volt, as a more stealthy look, they're just looking at your event logs. No one cares that someone's looking at their event logs. No one's monitoring for that. They just care that they're there, that they exist, and that they're shipping somewhere. So it just shows a total different mindset for how they're doing things and the overall end goal.
Yeah, when Epic Fury kicked off, in early 26 here, a lot of people were worried that Iran had pre-positioned things that, Volt Typhoon like that they would detonate. I wasn't worried about it, right? Iran has never held an access and not used it. They are so impatient that if they have an access, they're going to burn it. They're more willing to burn an access than almost any of the other, definitely more than any of the other nation state actors. And so I didn't see that they had this looming capability that they were going to unleash upon us at the time of Epic Fury. And it's pretty much borne out, right? And they've gone back and grabbed opportunistic things. Again, it goes way back to our earlier discussion of, if you want to be protected against Iran, one of the best things you can do is do the basics, because they're trying to figure out the easy button.
I lost what I was going to do with that. Oh, yeah. I'm curious. What do you think the reason is? I'm putting you on the spot. Why Iran is so impatient? I mean, I have my hypotheses.
I'm not sure, Bryson. I think, I think they live in the moment, and they can't assume that with all of the world ganging up on them, whether it's, through sanctions or kinetic effects or any of the other things, that they'll have the opportunity to pull the trigger later. So I think they live in the moment.
So my supposition, going back to the comment, the observation on Stuxnet informing the Iranian perspective on offensive cyber, was also tied to, so authoritarian regimes foment paranoia by definition. There is not really a rule of law, because whomever's at the top can make whatever happens. Part of that is why it begets corruption, like what we see in Russia. But with the Iranians, what was interesting about Stuxnet was that fed into the paranoia and the way they started executing their own members of staff, because they presumed they were sabotaging the facilities, as opposed to it being the Stuxnet software that was causing a reduction in output. And so my hypothesis here is that impatience ties forward to you need to be producing something constantly and now, or else you might be the next on the guillotine, because that ties in from the macro down to the tactical level and back to 2010 with Stuxnet, a certain flavor of paranoia.
Certainly a reasonable theory. Yeah.
I do try to be reasonable. I may not always be right, but I do try to be reasonable. So closing things out, Rob, what are your final thoughts?
I would say we all should be watching Iran. So first, they're almost like the wounded animal, right? They don't have much to lose, so they're willing to do things that are dangerous. And you saw the CISA, NSA, FBI warning on OT and Iranian capabilities, right? We've got to be on the lookout for that. They aren't the most sophisticated cyber actor in the world, but they're a very instructive one, right? Watch what they do. Others are taking notes. They're willing to try things some others won't. And I do think that, the cyber folks sometimes have a little tunnel vision and don't think about the way they layer on some of the persona and influence operations on top of those things. And that aggregation can be pretty powerful.
Trey?
My biggest takeaway, I think, to think about here is doing the foundational things right. We've preached it all episode, and if I have to say it a million more times, I will. understanding your environment, understanding what that looks like from a threat perspective, doing defense in depth methodologies, and even simple things like from the personal perspective. If your password manager or your phone's yelled at you recently because your password's too weak or it's been seen in a breach, you should probably go ahead and go change those, because those are the little bitty things that are going to make a big difference, right? We all can help with this process and ensure that not only our organizations are protected, but ourselves are protected in this instance, because the person is kind of a weak link in all of these situations.
So I think one of the things I'll end on is we talk about the fundamentals, but people disagree what the fundamentals are. And I think that's part of the challenge is there are so much noise, just like there is so much noise about threats and what these things mean from the headlines all the way to the threat intelligence reports that we get and what we're trying to do. Assume breach. Technical controls are half the battle, turns out. People isn't just the user, by the way. Security teams are made up of people, still will be. Even in the post-age of AI, it'll still be people. People make mistakes. People are only trained to do certain things, and people can only work with the tools when the tools work with them. And there will never be a moment where if you spend enough on detection and response, that will not pay off for you, is my final thought. The world is going to continue to balkanize, and we're going to continue to see an increase in threat activity because this space is so valuable from a return on investment for national and intelligence goals.
Wonderful.
Rob, Trey, well, not wonderful. That's the opposite of wonderful, but thank you. Good summary. Thanks, Bryson. Rob, Trey, thank you so much for joining me and scaring the pants off of everybody like a good security brief should be.
Great to be here with you. Thanks.
Thank you for your time, gents.